There are twin related concepts which assault our theological sensibility that are commonly quoted in the Hasidic world. Tzaddik gozer kadosh baruch hu mekayim, that a righteous person makes a decree and God is forced to fulfill the decree of the tzaddik, the Rebbe of the righteous person. And similarly, kadosh baruch hu gozer gzera, the flip side of the coin, that Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, can make a decree, the tzaddik mevatzla, quoted in the Gemara, and a righteous person cancels God's decree. Tanu Rabbanan, my Chanukah, the Gemara in Shabbos asks, what is Chanukah? And proceeds to answer with the story of the oil, eliminating largely the military aspect of Hanukkah altogether. A lot of ink has been spilled on that. We're not going to be focusing on that in this entry, though. So what to make of the Gemara's question, Maya Hanukkah? The Morei Naim, Menachem Nachum Twersky of Chernobyl, one of the leading students of the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid of Mezrich, and he had an interesting take on the question, which is instructive in offering a lesson for how we might deal with distress and suffering. One of the first entries that I spoke about related to Hanukkah with you all in this 8-part series, we discussed the view of the Rokeach, quoted in the Sfas Emes and other Hasidim, that the 36 candles of Hanukkah represent the Or HaGanuz, 36 hours of hidden light from the time of creation. And implicit in quoting all of that was a sense about how we can use the lighting of Hanukkah candles to cultivate an optimistic, faithful reality amidst total darkness at the darkest time of the year and in dark times in our lives, just like the Maccabees, the Jews were totally subsumed, assaulted, brutalized by Antiochus and his crew, but yet they were able to cultivate light and somehow draw strength and even win, not just put up a fight, but win the fight. So there's that's the mashal. What's the nimshal? So for us, there are so many versions of an all-consuming darkness. There's the local one we're in right now, right, about a pandemic, and even with a vaccine on the horizon, and so you kind of see it. But there's so many dark aspects of life that have been exposed in the pandemic. Better known, lesser known, racial tension. Better known, lesser known, our food system and the mutations caused by the factory farming of animals. Jonathan Safran Foer wrote some about that. Mink farming got some press, right, with the sort of euthanasia of mink farms in Scandinavia and other places in the Pacific Northwest. Just all the different ways in which there's a kind of interconnected darkness, which was part and parcel of the pandemic, or broadly, even without a pandemic, just the anonymity and numbness that can accompany modernity in all of its size at this point in human history. So whatever the darkness is for you, but we were addressing that, right? How do you cultivate a way out when it seems like there's no exit? So today I wanted to talk about a kind of different take on it that involves not sort of cultivating light, but actually leaning in a little bit more to the darkness. I recall this experience when I went to a blind museum in Israel, in Cholon, and the point of the museum was to help people who are not blind develop empathy for those who are by removing all light. And so you walk into a museum where there is no light. It is pitch black, it's dark. And there's a guide who is blind who guides your group. You have different activities to do. You have to figure out what kind of room you're in. I think wound up on an exercise bike, though I didn't know what it was. And at the end, you can order food and drinks in a cafe, but you can't see. And so everything from, finding the doorway and going and not tripping and falling on your face, trying to pay, all of it, you live through the experience and you see that there are people that do, and yet you can't. And that was a really interesting experience, right? Because you see there are people who, in that very same experience, are able somehow out of total darkness to cultivate a reality that they're more or less in some measure of mastery over, not unlike us in our current lives. And so the darkness becomes relative, and there's an ability to conquer it. But first, you have to lean into the darkness, get really comfortable with it and experience it. So this is the second part of that. What is Hanukkah? So the Me'or Einayim, Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl, says like this. It actually stands, people are familiar with Chanu Kafhe, they rested on the 25th of Kislev, but he has a different version of it. Chanu Ko. They rested in Ko, here, this, thus. They rested in mindfulness. They rested in that very present moment of darkness. So what does that mean? I'll just read from the entry. Sheish mida hanikres ko, v'himidas malchus. So the attribute of thus, of ko, here, present, thus, ko yeh, this is how it shall be, thus it shall be, is malchus, is shechina, is the indwelling divine presence in our world. Our world rests on an inner kernel of spiritual essence and of divinity. Chelik Elokam Yimal, piece of God above, or however you want to phrase it. And that is called Shechina, or Malchus. It's kind of the lowest sphera in the formal Kabbalistic sphirot. And all of the worlds operate according to this. The tzaddikim can rule over all the worlds. So this is the key, right? Is that God is in every world and every moment. And so even when we're suffering, and we tend to be the most disconnected and isolated, right? And suffering causes stress, which causes our focus on ourselves. We cut out other things in order to try and solve the problem, and adrenaline does that. And so we become more isolated and therefore more disconnected from the kind of transcendence which would lead us into spiritual and ultimately religious connection to God in a moment of stress. And yet, even as we are totally isolated as human individuals, alone without spiritual salvation in moments of stress, and yet God is in that moment still, no matter how indiscernible. It says in Shmuel that a tzaddik, a righteous person, rules over fear of God. Who can rule over God? Tzaddik. A tzaddik, a righteous person, rules over God. It says that a tzaddik, the righteous person, can cancel a decree of God. How? So he's going to work with this concept. The Zohar asks this question. What do you mean a righteous person overrules God? Is this not the height of hubris and of human narcissism? So the answer is no. When we say a tzaddik cancels a decree, a tzaddik doesn't cancel a decree. That's just our way of speaking about it. But of course that can happen. This is the concept. This is the key concept. Right? In every moment of distress, says the prophet Isaiah, God is also distressed. We meet God, or the pain of the exiled divine presence, exiled from Jerusalem, exiled from the Kodesh Kodashim, the destruction. God is exiled in our pain. That's the key feature of Yechezkel, of the prophecy of Ezekiel. It opens up with the Merkava, the chariot. But what does it mean that God is in a chariot? What is the whole point of a Maisa Merkava? That means that God is moving. God's on the move. Just as the Jewish people are going to exile with the destruction of Ezekiel, the temple, says Yechezkel, so too God is going into exile with them. God is leaving. That's the radical move. God is sharing in the experience of the pain of the Jewish people, or the unredeemed nature of the world more broadly. in all of their distress, it is also distressful to him. And so that's what it means. It's that by tapping into the full pain of the moment, not even partially, but by having, just like God has this uh, perspective or perspicacious ability to view it all. So the more we're able to tap into righteously the ability to perceive the full extent of the suffering and the pain, actually, God, we meet God. And it's actually in that moment that the full nature of the evil decree can begin to have healing, can begin to be canceled, because there's a camaraderie or a union in experiencing the pain and the suffering, and from there, a yearning. And really the seed or the origin of the sort of commitment to something beyond ourselves, which may have caused our suffering in the first place, right? Because it happened because of our sins. That's why the Mikdash was destroyed, as we say in all the various Musaf prayers, Rosh Chodesh, Sukkot, for which Hanukkah may be a makeup, Shabbat even. So there's this notion, right, that in beginning to recognize the shared nature of our world and our responsibilities, that our soul comes from God above, and everyone else's soul does too, that we have a responsibility to our people, to our Torah, to our history, to our future, to our maker. It begins to break the ego, which is often, and the selfishness and the self-centeredness and the lack of gratitude, which are so often at the root, the expectation, which are so often at the root of our modern sinful moments, individually and as a species. So that's how the tzaddik does it. Goes on to say that tzaddikim al yedei ma'aseim hatovim ma'alim kiviyachol hashchina, and then the righteous person, the tzaddik, as they've kind of descended to the depths, can lift up, so to speak, the divine presence. As it says, Tnu oz l'Elohim, in Tehillim, give power to God. Tnu oz l'Elohim, how can we give power to God? But by sharing in this experience and doing righteous actions, we can lift up God's presence in this world. As Echa Rabbah says, Yisrael mosifin koch b'pamalya shamayla, that Israel increases or adds potential energy, power to God above. So where does that leave us? Here, then, on Hanukkah, this is a different approach than the one quoted in the Sfas Emes. I would like to offer, different flavors of spiritual practice for lighting the candles. The candles are small, and in this case, kindling them can't just be done superficially. But first, we have to fully appreciate the extent of the darkness as a prerequisite to even being able to light. You can't light too soon, as it were. And so in this way, if you're going to actualize this into a practice for your candle lighting, you might spend some moments before you light, sitting and quietly reflecting, even breaking your heart on the pain of the moment in the world, or specifically as it relates to Hanukkah, right? And so, the Torah and the values that are central to the Torah and their lack of actualization in our harsh current climate, and really be with that. And then after some time, cultivating that sadness, then the lighting of the Chanukiah comes as a kind of tikkun, or a lift up, solace, for what is a tough practice of kindling just the smallest light and moving from there to begin to move forward. And just like the flame flickers and continues to raise upward, the flame becomes a sign of the Shekhinah, of the divine presence, which is also distressed. And so we feel bad for God, who's isolated too in the pain of this world. And we try and support God and lift God up. And in that way, kindling the flame itself in mitzvah begins that practice. We begin a path of redeeming not a pretend world, but redeeming our world, the one we actually live in.